Hello and welcome to my Arttacular classroom. I'm Emily and today I'm going to be showing you how to draw and watercolor paint if you would like a fuzzy fox. This is a slightly more illustrative style, but it's still on the more realistic end, so hopefully you're kind of getting the best of both worlds here. So let's just jump right into it. So first, I'm just going to quickly go over materials. Today I'm going to use a mechanical pencil. You can use a set of sketch pencils if you prefer, but we're sticking pretty basic today. So this is my mechanical eraser. It's my absolute favorite thing in the whole world. It's so small that I can get the really fine details and it works super well. This is a kneaded eraser or a kneadable eraser, and it's not very good for erasing, but it is really good for shading or like lightening up your lines if you make a mistake. Then I do also have like a regular eraser, but I don't use it at all today. Okay, so in terms of like the hand technique, I like to keep my fingers far away from the pencil lead. Helps me control my pencil strokes a little bit more, keeps things lighter. You want to stay light. So I'm also going to keep my wrist still and my fingers still, and I'm going to move my hand in the shape of an oval. I want to make sure that I have space on the right and above and below to draw in plenty of my fox. I'm not going to run out of room. And now I'm just going to keep my wrist and fingers still and start working on an oval. You want to keep yours about as light as I have mine there on the paper, but I am going to go darker, even darker than what you see right now, just to make sure that you can see. But you're probably going to want to go as light as you can. So next we're going to move on to the body oval, and it's just going to go partially through the head and over to the side. I also want it to be ever so slightly above the top of the head. So you can see here, if I take a ruler and I bring it across, you can see that the top of the body oval is higher than the top of the head oval, but the bottom of it is in line with the bottom of the head oval, and that is what you want. Okay, if you need to get caught up to this point, pause the video and start it when you're ready. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is proportion and scale. You can use what you have drawn to compare it to other parts of the body to make sure that you have it roughly the right size. For example, if you look at the fox's head here and you compare it to the body oval that is drawn in the reference, it's approximately 2 heads wide, the body oval is. So I went a little bit too short. I'm going to widen it up just a smidge there, erase what I had originally. And now I think I'm in good shape. So now we're just going to go right to the tail because it's the thing that's most in front. And we're just going to start kind of over near the right side of the body oval, start kind of in the middle of it, and draw a really stretched out rainbow arch. Underneath that, draw a super stretched out letter U that's going to connect with the right side of the body oval. Kind of in the middle of the body oval and just above the tail, draw in a little arch for the thigh or hip, and then move over to the head to draw in your head guidelines. These are going to go through the center of the face, both vertically and horizontally. Notice that it has some curve over to the left, and the eye line has some curve down below because the head is tilted down just a little bit. It's going to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you to figure out where to place your ears. The ear on the right is going to be a wider triangle. The one on the left is going to be just a little bit more perky, a little taller, and you're going to be able to see more of the back of the ear. If you need to get caught up to this point, pause the video and start it up again when you're ready. So now we can start figuring out where to place the nose, and we're going to use that center dividing line that went through the middle of the face to help kind of figure that out, as well as the eye line. So if you find the crosshairs, that's about where the snout is going to start. Just draw in a curved slope, a sloping curving line. Okay, I don't know how to say that. And then attach a little oval, almost kind of triangular shaped a little bit for the nose, right on the edge of that. To connect to the bottom jaw, we're just going to go straight out from the bottom of the head oval and kind of curve it up right underneath the nose. So now you pretty much have your basic sketch in, and now it's time to start working on the details. If you need to get caught up to this point, go ahead and pause the video and start up again when you're ready. The next thing I'm going to do is erase anything that I can't see. I like to start with the things that are most in front, like the tail, the snout, the head, the ears, and that way it just makes it a little bit easier if I work my way from the front to the back to figure out what I need to erase and how. So the snout would be the next most forward thing. Then the ears. Well, actually just that one ear, not the other one. The other one is hidden behind the head, slightly. And that's about it. Now, the fox's head is a little bit boxy, slightly more boxy foxy, so I'm just gonna carve into that oval a smidge to kind of capture that brow bone and make it just a little bit more realistic rather than like round. And that's just about it for the drawing. We just need to put in the eyes, maybe a mouth if you want to. I did try the mouth and then I kind of decided I didn't like it, so I just ended up erasing it. But the eyes are basically just going to be two little, almost like rotated letter L's, or maybe like letter V's that are kind of pointing down into the sides. Just go right where the nose meets the brow bone on both sides and draw in those two lines, one diagonal line and one horizontal line. Okay, so at this point, just go ahead and get caught up. If you need to pause the video, do that, and then start it up again when you are ready. So the next thing that we're gonna do is move on to the detailing, adding in some fur, getting in a little bit of shading, but I'm gonna have to do that after I've painted. Okay, so now it's a new day, but I realized that I kind of forgot to mention something very important, which is that you can either move on to the watercolor phase now and ink afterward, or you can ink now and move on to the watercolor after that. But it depends on what is the story with your ink. So I have India ink, and despite the fact that it claims it is waterproof, it is not. So I have to do it after I paint, otherwise it just turns into this horrible black smear. Now also, if you're only interested in drawing, I'm gonna move on and like bring that part of the video in now so that we can do the like drawing and sort of the shading and the sketching and the details and everything now, and then we'll go back to the watercolor. So if you're only drawing, this is for you. If you are watercoloring and you want to ink, I would probably recommend that you do it now, but test your ink on a scratch piece of paper first and find out what happens if you paint over it with watercolor, because you might have a sad story like I do. Anyway, okay, getting back to it. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use India ink, and you can easily just use like a fine tip Sharpie, a micron pen, whatever kind of ink you want, really. There's no right or wrong answer to this. But again, you'll probably want to test it on a scratch piece of paper first and see what happens, how it reacts with water, to decide when you want to ink. You can do it now or you can do it later. Okay, anyway, here we go. So I have my nib, which is what the metal tip of that pen is called, and it can be a little unruly sometimes. It kind of like makes the ink go a little crazy. So I do have a piece of scratch paper nearby so that I can kind of continuously check my lines and make sure that they're not going crazy. But I'm just going to start in the darkest areas first, which are going to be kind of like the undersides of things, where body parts come together, for example, like where the tail is obscuring the leg and the rest of the body, stuff like that. we're gonna start in those areas, and I just create these scribbly lines. I don't really think too hard about how I'm scribbling. A lot of my scribbles have spaces in between them. I'm not creating perfect little triangular shapes. You can if you want to, that's just not how I do it. So I'm also making sure that all of my little strokes, pen strokes, are headed in the direction that the fur would be growing. So the fur is almost always sticking out from wherever it is. The back fur is going to be kind of tilted up and to the right, and then as you get more toward its bum, it's going to be like angled a little bit more down and to the right. You get the idea, almost like the sun's rays. In places like the ears and the face, any ink details that you add, you're probably going to want to keep really small. I almost did just little tiny dashed lines for the ears, practically even little dots. Kind of the same thing for the top of the head, just if there's shorter fur, I usually do shorter lines. So now as I start detailing the eyes, this is where I want to be really careful about the width of my lines, because again, the face is small, the details are small, you're going to want to make the fur texture small. Otherwise it'll pull too much focus away from the face. So I'm just trying to be really careful about controlling how dark my lines get, which is why I keep kind of tapping my pen off on the scratch paper there. Doesn't do as much as I wish it would, which you'll see in a moment. And then I'm just gonna go into the tail, which again is kind of where the darkest fur is. The fur tends to start to kind of mix in with some like browner, grayer fur in the tail. Which I think you can see in the example above. I actually used some paint to create some of that brownish gray fur, but in this example I did not. It looks fine, either with the ink or with a little bit of paint and ink. You can decide which one you like better. But I'm gonna keep the lines closer together, and I want to do more of them on the underside of the tail to keep the shadow stronger on the bottom. Next thing I'm going to do is hatch, or do hatching lines. This is just a shading technique, basically where you use lines to create shadows. You can do hatching, you can do cross hatching, contour hatching, whatever. I'm doing cross hatching here. As you can see, the lines are going in both directions. This can be a surprisingly difficult technique to make look kind of clean. So just, spend some time on getting your lines how you want them to be, in case you accidentally go a little overboard. I have found that I do that many times, that I have done that many times. And I'm just hatching in areas where there's going to be significant shadows, which is pretty much just where the leg meets the body, the leg meets the tail meets the body, and that's about it. The insides of the ears are also going to be pretty dark, but I'm more focused on creating the fur texture inside of the ears, kind of having those hairs bend upward toward the top of the ear, almost like a like a TP, I guess. Here's where my pen goes a little bit overboard with the texture. I'm starting to just put in some little tiny hairs to create some, you know, interest, I guess, in the face. But despite how hard I tried, I ended up with just too much ink right there. Beautiful. Love it. Nah, I'll fix it later. I can a little bit. One nice thing about India ink being water-based, not super waterproof. But for the moment, I'm gonna let those little blots dry. If I try to blot them out right now, I can just see my towel, my rag, just making it go crazy and creating big splotchy splotches. So now that it's dried a little bit and I go back over it with my towel, it's a little less intense, but it didn't smear. For now, I'm just going to let it dry completely and move on, and then I'll go back and try to lift it out with my paintbrush. Just adding a little bit of texture into the grass. Now let's talk a little bit about lifting. Lifting is a technique of putting water back on your paper where there's paint and using your brush or a rag to essentially kind of like erase the paint off of the paper. Again, because the India ink for whatever reason is not very waterproof, I was able to get it wet and then sort of gently, carefully dab it off, which made those details a lot less intrusive. So that is the drawing portion. We are now going to move on to the watercolor portion. If you're interested, again, you don't have to. Let's just quickly start with materials. So I've got my Da Vinci watercolor paint palette, which I'll show you in more detail in a little bit. I have a mixing palette, which is made of ceramic. It's my personal preference for mixing palettes. It just seems to work better than plastic or metal. A variety of round brushes and a flat wash brush. I have also 2 containers for water, one with clean water and one with dirty water. Okay, so Denise's earth-friendly Da Vinci watercolor palette is my favorite, and I'm going to be using quinacridone burnt orange, probably mixed with a little bit of Indanthrene blue in some places. I do also end up using violet iron oxide, plus other colors, but we're just going to start with these for now. All right, so we are going to be using the wet on wet technique, which basically means putting water down on the paper first before you put paint down. It's going to make it nice and fuzzy, but first it's probably helpful to do some practice strokes. So I'm going to get my brush wet, get my paper wet. You can hopefully see that the brush is not dripping, doesn't have like drops of water that are threatening to fall out of there. I'm going to try to show you about how much water you want to have. So with the light on, hopefully you can see that it's just shiny, not really dripping. There maybe are a few little pools of water kind of where I'm pointing with my paintbrush, but you can't really see it super well. They're not very big. You kind of want to try to avoid those, but I think in this case for this little practice, it's okay. The paper also dries really fast. So I'm just going to grab a little sample color here. Notice that the brush is not dripping. It is mostly paint, not water. Maybe that's just a little too diluted with water. I'm going to try one more time, grabbing straight from the paint source, the paint pan. And now, hopefully, you can see that it has this lovely, bleedy, fuzzy texture. And anywhere where there's water on the paper, that's where it's going to be soft. But as soon as you start getting outside of the boundaries of the water on the paper, you'll get super crisp, clean lines. So that's the difference between the wet on wet method and the wet on dry method. Wet on dry is kind of better for like finer details. Wet on wet is good for blending and creating really soft, especially fuzzy textures. First thing I usually like to do is get my watercolor palette wet. A lot of artists like to use a spray bottle for this, so I'll just kind of drop a little bit of water into my paint pans. And now we are going to put water down on the paper. So I'm avoiding the nose, only the nose for right now. But the biggest, most important thing that I want to pay attention to is, am I getting water outside of the pencil lines? You want to. And then once again, you want to make sure that you don't have too much water. Hopefully you can see there that it really pooled like at the bottom of the chin. I'm trying to show you. It's nearly impossible. Anyway, making sure that your water gets outside of the pencil lines hopefully will allow the paint to bleed outside of the pencil lines and kind of create the fuzz in the shape that you want it to be. So you want to put the water outside the pencil lines, but when you paint, you'll stay inside the pencil lines. So I'm grabbing my quinacridone burnt orange, making sure that it's not too diluted. Again, you want it to be kind of saturated with paint, otherwise it might not be as fuzzy. And I'm just gonna go right in, painting everything except for the ears and the nose and the bottom of the snout, where the white part of the fox's face is. I can concentrate my paint strokes in areas where I want more shadowing, for example, between the leg and the tail, the leg and the body, etc. But we're also going to come back in with a slightly darker version of this color, and that will also suffice to create those shadows. So here, as I'm working on the face, I can already see that my paper dried too much before I started on those paint strokes. They're too wet on dry. If you compare them to the tail is like really soft and there's no solid edge, but the ears, there definitely is. So I get my round brush wet, dab it off, and use the tip of the brush to sort of grab the edge of the painted shape and allow it to bleed itself outside of its boundary a little bit. Didn't quite work there on the side of the head. The paint was just too dry at that point. But it's okay, it's not the end of the world. I will be able to fix it, either by dabbing in a little more paint now, or I can wait for it to dry completely and kind of add some more on later. Okay, so here I am getting ready to add in like the shadowy areas, and again, like I said, I'm using that violet iron oxide. It's basically just kind of like a purpley red brown. I did decide to mix it just a little bit with the blue and then also with the quinacridone burnt orange so that it maintains its sort of coppery tones. And I should have done this when the paper was wetter. It looked wetter than it was to create the fuzz inside of that shadow. But again, it's not the end of the world. I can use my wet brush to sort of blend out the edges of that shape. I do have to be a little bit careful with that though, because it can create what's called cauliflowers or blooms, whichever you prefer to call them. And those happen when your paper is too dry or sometimes too wet. It basically just is what happens when you get water sort of concentrated and dropped inside of an area where there is already concentrated paint. So again, if you want to do more like the top illustration, as soon as this is dry, you can take this violet iron oxide color, this kind of like purpley brown, and use that to paint in little strokes along the tail, but wait until it's dry. Those are best wet on dry. Okay, so just sort of outlining the snout a little bit, defining the eyes. Gonna dry it off. If you need to catch up to this point, pause and start when you're ready. As the face is dry enough, this is an okay time to start painting in the nose. I could also just do this with the ink. But I did also like using this kind of black colored, watering it down so that it's grayer and making it just a little bit easier for me to create some more texture inside the ear, a little bit more hollowness inside the ear. Watercolor paint dries lighter than it is when it's wet. So even though those kind of look like really dark, really blotchy patches of gray inside the ear, they're not going to be that bad later. All right, so I think that's probably pretty good for the painting portion. If you're already inked, you'd be pretty much done here. If you're not inked, then you would go back to that spot and do it. But first, let's put in the grass. So lastly, just to finish up the fox, again, the watercolor dried a little bit light, so I think I'm going to do one more coat of the quinacridone orange to saturate the color and also deepen any shadowed areas. So I am trying to keep it, you know, pretty thick still and not too diluted with water, though I kind of failed at that. But I'll start in the areas where the shadows are most intense. Not too focused on creating really solid shapes here. Blurry and fuzzy is good. And if I end up with something that's a little too intense like I did on the face there, I can use a damp brush to blend it out so that it's not so hard-edged. And dry it off. If you need to pause, get caught up, this is a good time. All right, so as I'm starting to work on the grass, I'm just gonna choose 3 different greens. One of them is a really yellow green, one of them is a more neutral green, like it's not neutral meaning brown or gray, but like not super cool, not super warm. And then the last one is a really cool green. So I have green gold, Denise's green, and phthalo green. I'm gonna start with the mid green. This is the one that's kind of gonna be like the base color, and then I'm gonna use the green gold, the yellow green, to create some highlights in the grass, and the phthalo green to add a little bit more shadowing. And I'm just doing this wet on dry, but allowing the water on the paper already to create some blends, especially when I add new colors. So here I'm adding the green gold, and I'm just kind of adding it in on top of other patches of green that I've already painted, allowing it to sort of blend itself out. And I don't really care too much about, you know, getting perfect lines. I think the texture is nice, especially when it kind of creates those blooms and cauliflowers. So I'm just letting it go here. But it's also nice to have some slightly darker shadows, so I also grabbed my Paraline green, which is like a dark forest green, and just popped that underneath the fox and also in the background to create a little bit more grass texture. All right, and now we're back to the inking phase. If you need to do it now, this is where you would do it. And that kind of, you know, that just brings us all the way back around in a full circle, a full weird circle loop. All right, and that is the tutorial. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you liked your painting, but you know, if you didn't, it's okay. You can always try it again. You can always use it for scratch paper. You can always throw it in the trash and never look at it again. It's totally up to you. But anyway, please do check me out at arttacularstudios.com, links below. You can check out my Instagram handles, because yes, I have 2. at Arttacular or at Ebbey Comics, Ebbey Comics. Kind of weird, I know. And I hope that you'll stay tuned for more. Have an Arttacular day.